Hello everyone, today we talk about asceticism and monasticism in the late antique and early modern eras. And I've done just today, we'll practically see how monasticism, the monastic experience spread from its origin in the Near East, in Egypt, into eventually into Europe, into Christian Europe, in this phase, in this moment of transition about which we have talked on Schwerpunkt now for a while under perspectives, political, social, economical ones, and as we will see, even the spread of monasticism was deeply intertwined also with these aspects. I like very much the history of monasticism, even if I'm not an expert. I had the luck to get fascinated about it at university. Especially remember the 2 years of my master degree I had on these two exams. Each one, it really opened kind of a world in there. If as a military historian, probably it's weird that if I could have studied anything else, I would have probably studied history of religions, because it's so very fascinating under so many points of view, even at the the limits of anthropology, not just strictly history of religion as such. And I dedicated to Schwerpunkt some videos to monasticism, although I've mostly talked about monasticism in post-Carolingian Europe, so stressing chiefly this increasing connection that existed between the essentially the lay aristocracies and the ecclesiastical ones, and the development of monasteries in this moment of political fragmentation, so that the monasteries began to they practically became several lordships on their own. To the very origins of monasticism, I dedicated very few, actually only one video that now is also relatively old, which is, if you're interested in, it's telling the truth, useful and a bit introductory to today's one. The title is The Roots of Christian Monasticism, in which I look actually at a broader geographical consideration of how Christian monasticism was I would say massively influenced by other monastic experiences coming from the East, and other philosophies and other religions. And I take into consideration also a bit what was the kind of inner, even also psychological, if you want, experience of the early monasticism, especially before it arrived into Europe. Today, instead, we focus exactly on this moment and how this also lifestyle in forms of or associated of social organization, let's say, developed. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. Here we go. So an interesting aspect of the spread of monasticism is kind of the dual the existence practically also of the spread of Christianism, telling the truth, into two channels, essentially the episcopal one, the probably ecclesiastical one, if you want, also the secular clergy, that will explain now the exact difference, and in fact the regular one, so the one who was regulated monastically speaking. So thinking about the spread of monasticism, we have always to take into consideration that it went in parallel with this very capillary organization that existed since a very early age into the lands of the Roman Empire, and eventually also when the Roman Empire vanished in the West, into provinces, dioceses, and parishes that basically went in parallel in turn to the territorial one of the state. This is very important to understand, because if you take Diocletian's reforms, I made a video on Diocletian reforms, you can look at that. I think the title of the video is something like Diocletian's government, something like that, and that explains a little bit, but I think most of you are already acquainted to the fact that basically at the end of the Principatus, essentially in the beginning of the Dominatus, the Roman Empire was restructured from an administrative point of view, and these bigger chunks that had been the provinces of the early imperial times, also late Republican times, were medieval, actually, because the very first provinces were like in the 3rd century BC, now had been segmented into a more fractioned structure that, however, was paradoxically in this sense more controlled by the state, wanted a more direct control locally on a provincial scale. And some of these had been called, the greatest group is actually also in the same Roman administrations had been the dioceses, that eventually were the ones that around which the same Christian dioceses would practically revolve, as we have seen many times with talking about the spread of Christianism. The very first and more rooted spread of Christianity into Europe happened on the base of the cities, essentially in the same centers of the Roman power, and there is a great continuity between the ecclesiastical organization and the statal one, let's say. This is important because this kind of created a channel through which further Christian experiences could be practically channeled. They could essentially vehiculate, I don't know whether it's a transmitted, spread, convey, I don't know how to use it in English, into the rest of Europe. A great, an important dynamic that naturally evidences the differences also that existed between city and countryside. The Christianity took much longer time to spread into the countryside, whereas maybe a city had remained largely Christian already from centuries, while the countryside was relatively extraneous to this. Obviously, everything was much more hybrid than we imagined. Wasn't such a strong resistance to Christianization proper. If anything, there was a strong resistance to maintenance of certain beliefs and practices that lived on. You can argue, I'm not saying literally in the same way until today, but still we have evidence during the modern, in this especially largely rural world, that such beliefs already existed. Now, consider that in post-industrial times we are not post-industrial, but after the in industrial times, indeed, we live in essentially the majority of the population lives into the city. So also the world of the countryside kind of disappeared, and all the people who went living in the city kind of secularized. But up to a very few generations ago, there were beliefs and ideas that naturally were not even rationalized as a relic of the pagan past, but practically they were, and owed much to it from a world that in fact up to that time had not changed substantially, because many rites and traditions and so on and were existed since the Bronze Age, were something that albeit transforming indeed, was however also tied to this kind of forever ongoing process of the natural cycles, seasonal cycles and so on, so that they didn't have into the countryside many reasons to be changed, and essential as life kept revolving around those same dynamics. But the experience of the city was not all. This is what we will see today, that monasticism was largely a rural phenomenon. At this point, basically, monasticism starts entering to the cities just to the low Middle Ages, or the high Middle Ages, depends on how you want to periodize that, with the mendicant orders that at that point were designed practically to target essentially the cities because of the heresies that were spreading in there, whereas the monastery up to that point had remained relatively detached from the urban environment. I say relatively because also this picture of monks basically lost into the countryside, into the forests, into the mountains, is kind of a very also relative evidence. Like the contact with the rest of the world, with the community, was always exists and never disappeared, and that was actually what monasticism was conceived like. even in the most extreme forms of asceticism, the idea is that someone had basically to know and to see what you were doing as a hermit in order to be inspired by it and essentially imitate it, because this was the objective of monasticism in the principle. I mean, the idea that the monastic community was not something that was destined to remain isolated and kind of forgotten by the rest of society, but on the contrary, the objective was to transform everybody into a monk and to live, as the monastery was the symbol of the heavenly Jerusalem, and it had to be physically extended to the rest of the world in theory. Naturally, this always went very very far from being accomplished, but nevertheless, it's important that this was, from their perspective, the idea, and this definitely had an influence. I mean, there were so many sovereigns and important figures that eventually decided also to participate in the monastic experience, to have that kind of of drawing the certain monastic models from their kind of lifestyle. I think, especially in the Kingdom of France, the French king was, for instance, vassal of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and there were so many. I think about Louis IX. Excuse me, a Facebook message. I forgot to switch it down. Okay, and the the monastery was always a model also for the secular world. And there were naturally also certain rivalries between the secular and the regular clergy. So monasticism is essentially a Christian, way, not necessarily a Christian one, but in the case today we'll talk about Christianism, that essentially propose another way of living and configuring its own communitary experiences. This is monasticism in what it is as a social phenomenon. And the clergy at this point in history was started to be distinguished, as we've said before, in the so-called secular one, that was destined to remain in the seculum, that is into the world practically, remaining in contact with believers, in fact, with the church community. Excuse me, I close the door. 1 second. And also open the window. Sorry. And the other clergy was the regular one. As we said before, it was regulated. Was essentially organized in monastic orders that basically lived each own according to a specific ensemble of norms that were accurately prescribed and that were called the rules, the regula in Latin. So let's give a look to the kind of the origins of this. I mean, from a kind of religious point of view, not just and that's why I mentioned you before that that video I made on the origins of monasticism, because now I will essentially discuss just about the Christian origins of the of monasticism. But definitely there were so many others, and you have to think at this time such monastic experiences were not just pertaining to Christianism, not even into the geographically speaking there in the Near East where they started developing. Also Judaism had a form of monasticism, Buddhism, and so on. So and that area of the world was still extremely open, and similarly, the crossroads, so many beliefs, philosophies, and so on. East and West, Asia and Europe were extremely interconnected at this point, especially before the the beginning of the Great. But they always remain interconnected, and perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of Eurasian history is this ongoing interconnection of ideas, beliefs, and so on that is quite overlooked, as sometimes we like to distinguish, the West and the enormous kind of horde-like barbarous East that is this kind of very exotic, weird thing. But actually, we all kind of come also from the if you look at the history of civilization, and everything kind of began into Mesopotamia and into Egypt, and then eventually spread elsewhere. And we can't objectively, Christianism is a Semitic religion, indeed, in its cultural origins. We live with throughout this experience. And by the way, monasticism remained for a long time. Naturally, we most likely said there were also different types of monasticisms. Even in Western Europe, for instance, even there was a difference between the Eastern Christian tradition, monastic tradition, and Western one that got increased, but at many times was kind of rejection of these Eastern elements, especially through Rome. For instance, during the Arab invasions or the iconoclasm, there were lots of Eastern refugees that came from chiefly to Italy, and then arrived also into other areas of Western Europe up to England and so on, who contributed as men of culture, of letters, and of religion, as monks and other figures of that were experimenting this new form to influence Western monasticism. So in order to understand the monastic movement, it's very, very important to keep in mind that the Christian religion had been developed in the continuous dialectic between two major aspirations. The first one was kind of I don't even know how to say it in English, but it's like the kind of the escaping from the world. I mean, the idea of this escape, this need to separate oneself from I wouldn't say reality, but to this worldly dimension, practically, to obviously research a more spiritual experience that was not influenced by further, by external distractions, passions, and so on. And you realize, if you have studied the history of philosophy during the ancient world, so this was all over. You think about Stoicism, think about Epicureanism, and so on. But and these were all intertwined, in fact, and we have actually extensive proof also. Think about Buddhism. Think about the Epicurean quadripharmacus and confront it with the Buddhist principles. I mean, that are actually very close things. So these were things that were existing over and over again, and it would be also very interesting to see how much, in fact, monasticism, in this sense of escape from the world, is something can be fully kind of categorized, because objectively it's full of so many experiences also in other societies that we don't talk about monasticism for. Every kind of tribal society, for instance, has a certain individuals of the group, certain members of the group that kind of get expelled, isolated from the group, to reach even a sort of, especially those figures that like the shamans, for instance, need to basically live into the wilderness to be isolated. So it's something that has very deep roots from the time of, when we were hunter-gatherers. These were kind of just more developed and also socially organized experiences that, however, had a kind of very ancient roots that are lost kind of in the mist of reality. But this is it's kind of normal. I mean, I can't say, but how many times did you want to, I don't know, to clear your mind from your studying, your job, other things, other problems, and going to take a beautiful walk in nature. That's something I like doing, for instance, every once in a while. And that's kind of, there is a fascination with it. I mean, with the world of nature, being alone into the nature, listening also the sounds, the experience. It was a sensorial experience, and consider which time these people lived. I mean, also society was kind of very different from our own. Today we have so many different influences and steering stimulus, and we kind of are surrounded by things that attract our attention. We get fascinated by. Think about all the times all the time we spend sitting on in front of a screen. Isn't that a form of isolation? So this thing is kind of a more widespread experience we can imagine. But from a Christian point of view, from a strictly Christian point of view, the aim of monasticism was to basically take refuge. I mean, this escape from the world was taking refuge in the divine model of Jesus. And this model basically had taught to depreciate, in the actual etymological sense of the word, the earthly goods, and especially power and riches, which also in a Christian sense are not really a complete depreciation of material reality as such, but let's say what it can, it's most like what it affects in the spirit, like, and this is present also in Islam. It's present in many other traditions in this sense. So the idea of kind of being humble enough. From the other side, there is also another tension, that is the one of the love towards your neighbor, to the attention to charity, for instance, that it entailed obviously instead a social role, because it basically brought you to commit yourself into this world, into this life. So two different directions that were kind of difficult to follow, because I believe personally Christianity shows an absolute towards which the believer had to tend, basically, but because of original sin and all the general faults and weakness of human nature, basically this cannot fully be achieved. So you basically can these are practices that also were born as a kind of general teaching that eventually found a kind of a practical organization, and in this sense monasticism, also the same church as it was formed eventually from an administrative point of view, was kind of a necessity that was realized to be felt as imperfect, because it was made up by human beings, but that inherently, according to the naturally to Christianism, it contains in itself, it's holy, contains the Holy Spirit, and also out of it you can basically receive it, so receive the grace. So this is you understand the dual dimension of existence that incidentally was stressed, in fact, by the especially by the first experience, by the ascetic one, because basically this one said, okay, let's get rid basically of everything material, so we don't have to deal with it. Let's just go into the desert and try to live like that, and so we don't create any kind of problem. There was a well, I'm not an expert now, but it's really about at that point the individual relation with the divine, but also the kind of the reduction to a minimum of all the problems that can derive from a form of organization, and obviously the sins, the faults, all that can derive from the human interaction in a certain way. And of such commitment, especially during the first centuries of Christianity, the major expression had been the martyrs, basically. So the martyr is a term that it basically means the witness, because they were witnessing Christ just before the death. Because according to the martyrs, basically, if you look at the all the hagiographical tradition, is that they saw the Christ appeared to them in the moment of death while they were being killed. So they witnessed this, and they came to have this lifelike, this Christ-like experience of the passion, of the martyrdom, and so of the sacrifice. And this was meant, I mean, to sacrifice your own life in order to save the eternal life of your own brothers and sisters. Because the example of the martyrs was meant to inspire naturally all the others, and to show in this form a very radical way. Because, by the way, martyrdom, to show your fellow believers, because martyrdom, and this is evident also from very often from the same Christian hagiography, that the Romans, at that point when the Roman state didn't tolerate Christianity and outlawed it, it's not really that they wanted to kill these people by standard. That's also a lot of that has been written about such things. But also in hagiography, you find the Roman authorities asking several times, are you sure you want to insist into this, because we're going to kill you? And they were asked several times. So these people were fanatically and stubbornly saying, no, we don't. We will not make our sacrifice to the emperor. We will not commit this act of idolatry. And they were, in this sense, they made a very radical choice. In fact, was very difficultly understood also by this is all hagiography speaking, and the same sources tell us that the same fellow Christian relatives or friends that implored these martyrs to say, okay, just make the sacrifice. Do not get yourself killed, because it's not really a problem. And there were some forms of there was a lot of debate relatively to this into the early Christianity, whether, because there were largely lots of Christians that in order to save their lives, they simply made this kind of sacrifice. It was required to burn these 2 grains of frankincense to the imperial deity of the empire, and that was it. And there were even certain Christian, I don't remember, it was even some father of the church possibly at a point said, if you're really obliged, no, I don't think it was a father of the church, but it was believed, I would think quite understandably, that there were Saint Christians who said, okay, it doesn't happen actually anything if you burn those 2 grains of frankincense, and you don't get persecuted, because that was actually the point. So the martyr experience had been very, very dramatic in itself, and it was kind of an extreme in this way. In fact, if you read Christian hagiography of this first century, you realize also from the terms that are used that all the fire-like, kind of this inflamed attitude. This I don't even know how to define it, but an inner attitude of these martyrs that were sort of kind of possessed and crazed by this belief, and that believed in it so strongly that also to get martyrized, executed for no other apparently incomprehensible reason, also for other Christians that, however, now were celebrating their courage, their spirit of sacrifice, and of self-sacrifice and abnegation, just like Christ had showed by sacrificing himself for for saving humanity. So it was felt really as martyrdom was felt as a great as the mean through which the same Christian society could be saved, as by maintaining essentially Christ's example. So this was a path. The other one was the path heading towards monasticism, of the instance of humiliation. The humiliation of earthly life, that the monks were essentially accepting in different ways. And it was very initially speaking, the monastic experiences were extremely spontaneous. So there wasn't just one way. Monasticism wasn't born, the kind of stereotypical picture we have of monasticism is this kind of ruled monks living only in one place, meaning all kind of standardized according to the discipline and so on. But monasticism was born just as a kind of from these experiences that already existed of communities that lived into the wilderness, that had this kind of retirement from escape from the world, and living in conditions, but because you have to think also at the time many people actually lived in this way by default. I mean, by themselves. The idea of living into the wilderness is definitely something we have difficulties to understand today, but that at the time wasn't objectively that unusual after all, especially for definitely the majority of the Roman population at this point lived into conditions that were not the usual lifestyle, the urban lifestyle in the cities with the baths, with the libraries, with the games and so on. There were people living into the countryside, having a pretty austere and also sacrificed life, and we will see how this actually also found this allowed to say monastic experience to spread so widely, because after all there were people who didn't live very differently from monks already into everyday life at the time, in terms especially of material poverty, and that's also why the Christianity in general spread so much, because it was naturally appealing to the more humble strata of the population, of the poor, of the marginated, of all those who now were also through the centuries of the lower empire kind of increasing as these masses of disowned, of impoverished and deprived people, and criticizing naturally also the political and social system and so on. And hence the riches of and emphasizing the idea that kind of everybody had to be poor at the time. I mean, there were certain Christian instances that said, if there have to be a few rich people and lots of poor, let's kind of settle down in a more homogeneous way, where everybody's kind of poor, and so that we don't have any differences anymore. This is literally what was done. I personally disagree very much with this thing. I like when people are kind of well off, and if you can't have it, still I believe that who is able to make more money, honestly, should enjoy that money, and also others can benefit directly from it. But this is, I don't want to get political, but there were these ideas, and naturally we look at Christianity just from a strictly religious point of view, but there were, as all times in history, actually mostly political and social reasons for which even certain religions spread that have actually very few to do with religion, or at least even if they are intertwined at all times, they still, here that's something I remember always in Schwerpunkt. the adherence to Christianity was extremely superficial many times. It was just a formal way. After all, we have to think this was a world that was used with the typical pagan contractualism of the of polytheism. So, in order to make understand this population what actually Christianity means, is something that goes far beyond any form of contractualism, because actually it's something, especially Christianity in itself, is even the surpassing of the law, the idea that you have to stick even to certain rules, and it's really a much more it's a much wider experience, spiritually speaking, and it's extremely more challenging. It's extremely more complicated than others. Many people didn't understand this. How many of the poor actually understood the Bible at this point? But not. I don't mean reading it, because obviously most of them now couldn't read. But really understanding the true message. I mean, from a theological point of view, because that's also a point. One thing is, receiving the promise you will be saved, and that's a message you can understand quite easily, and how to be good, to do certain things. It was a ritual also in Christianity, but how many of these people kind of understood it and just hope to be saved just for receiving, Eucharisty, and and that's something really also pretty evident, given all what we know about the syncrasies that still existed between Christianity and paganism for centuries and centuries after these areas had been allegedly Christianized from a formal way. And I don't think that the church was extremely obsessed with this either. I mean, the idea that, of course, there was an orthodoxy, a dogma to defend from a certain point onwards. The orthodoxy has always been a great concern initially. Then there was also dogma that was formalized later from Nicaea, but also, there was a kind of a strategical, very pragmatical strategical need at a certain point. I mean, controlling a diocese, for instance, in the West, let's assume, and it was a matter of really controlling the city. Point. Even if the rest of the countryside was kind of pagan, or it was difficult for them for the church to penetrate in this world and to kind of evangelizing in an effective way. The important is that the order was not challenged, and then if peasants were ignorant and illiterate and didn't understand a damn about the Bible, was kind of their problem. But as long as they didn't create problems to others and to the organization of the church, everything was fine. So there is also this kind of more pragmatic approach to the church organization that has to be taken into consideration. So the humiliation of earthly life was aimed essentially at turning the back to the flatteries and the pleasures of the world. And this experience was called, in fact, there was a form of sacrifice, just martyrdom. It was called a kind of bloodless martyrdom, because it didn't entail, in fact, this extreme form of sacrificing yourself physically to be killed. Naturally, at this point, the Roman Empire was Christian already, so there were no persecutions proper, even though also the Christians definitely persecuted also other communities at one point. I mean, the Christians in other communities at a certain time were kind of literally killing each other, making mass, causing uprisings. Also in here, it wasn't really a matter of religion. It was mostly a political reason, and this is evident from anyone who has even kind of approached the literature that exists on the topic. So an extremely complex scenario that should be actually studied. I don't think on Schwerpunkt we will have the time and the expertise to go in depth into this, but also in here you find so many criticism from one side or the other. There are people who are pro-Christian, people were anti-Christian, and they keep killing each other in this sense. But what the real historical point is saying, what was this really in the first place? But people prefer to project their own personal thing because they feel a need to stress, I don't know, maybe that they're special and so on, and then history that is there remains kind of ignored, and while we actually have the answers to explain what happened. But definitely monasticism was also coming from the objective fact that once the Roman Empire had been Christianized, objectively there were no many ways of sacrifice that could be accomplished from this clamorous and socially didactic point of view. So monasticism at this point was the answer. It was essentially a life of contemplation that was, as we have seen, was nothing new at the time, but now was edited and experienced in a Christian fashion. With an educational purpose. So who were the monks? What does actually monk mean? Monk is a word that comes from the Greek monos, which means only, and in this sense is in the acception of solitary. So it's like the monad. It's something that stays on its own, basically, and retired in. At least not mixed with other elements. You know that early Christianity is dominated. So it's a Greek-speaking experience. Even the Bible was initially written in Greek, and so the Gospels were written in Greek, and also the same Bible. I mean, for what it had arrived, especially to the West, as in en masse, as the Christianity spread first into the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a Greek-speaking area, so it just eventually was translated into Latin. And it's something relatively late. So, as we were saying before, this phenomenon of the research of the solitude is not new to the history of many religious or communities or philosophical sects. As we were saying before, Hinduism or Buddhism have both, for instance, a very long and famous monastic tradition. Also, for the Christians, as we have seen, monasticism came from the East. Christian monasticism was born into actually first in Africa, first in Egypt in the 3rd century, and then it spread into Syria and Palestine. So it was of a so-called anachoritic monasticism, that is essentially a hermetic form of monasticism that was made up of isolated individuals that lived into the desert and started praying, to fast, and to carry out certain ascetical practices that were even at the time sometimes considered apparently very, very strange. Certain hermits, as we've seen, didn't abandon, for instance, completely the cities. However, they found a way to isolate themselves in other ways from the social, from society in itself. For instance, it's very famous, the case of the Stylites, that spent their existence being settled basically on the top of certain columns and basically living there an entire life. Church initially, and this is very important actually, wasn't very favorable to monasticism. And church didn't like it at all, telling the truth, because this basically exasperated certain monasticism exasperated the relation between Christianism and society, and very often they gave birth to incontrollable doctrinal deviations or other very strange behaviors. This is important because you've seen that monasticism was born before definitely the official Christianization of the empire, and also in times where Christianity was still outlawed. Now, naturally, the 3rd century was a moment of great spread of Christianity, but it was still a moment in which there was a huge debate, actually, and it would remain so, relatively to Christianism, to Christianity in itself. I mean, whether it was a threat for the social order, for the political order, and the church at the beginning was kind of trying to mediate between with the rest of society, of non-Christian society, to show that Christianity was actually a positive thing. There is a beautiful Christian literature from this time that actually expresses, what is that we do bad for deserving such persecutions every now and then. Well, we are Christians, we work just like other people. We also we contribute to the very society that is kind of is deploring us. So there was this attempt to kind of say, look, we are socially acceptable, because Christianity now is also spreading among every kind of strata of society. I mean, there was no house, but it happened in this time, I don't know, maybe a son was Christian into a pagan family, or a serf was Christian. I mean, the Christians now were spreading kind of everywhere. So the church that had been born theoretically on Christ's model as a sort of uncompromising society, now was trying to say, okay, we have surely our own way of thinking, we have our own looking at the world, and in theory, naturally there are certain extremes that have to be met, but for now we are kind of nobody is hurt if he is Christian at this point. There is nothing actually subversive as this, as we're accused of, subverting the. And naturally, this was not accepted by others, because the whole problem with Christianity at this point, from the Roman point of view, was that it basically was a religion that denied this kind of civic religion of state, for which it wasn't really a matter of what you professed, but as long as as you participated in these religions, so you didn't carry out things like witchery or other things that were considered by the Romans to be too socially detrimental for some reasons, it would have been enough, even for the single Christians, in fact, to pay, to pay respect to the imperial deity, to sacrifice to it, and just to be left alone. Nobody cared where, what religion you were, where you came from, as long as you accepted, you contributed to the statal religion, everything was fine, because the pagans believed at that time that objectively, if something went wrong, it was because someone had not respected the gods. So, and this was purely formal. It just required this adherence with a normal sacrifice point, like those 2 grains of frankincense. That was it. It wasn't required anything else, but it was required. That was the only thing that was required. So the empire was tolerant, basically for everything, except for these other things about magics or dark occult things and witchery and so on, were considered kind of superstitions. Also Christianity was considered at this point a superstition because it was adverse, in fact, to the religious functioning of this social order. But from a politic perspective, it was completely fine to have people who believed other things, and nobody cares as long as they sacrifice to the statal deity. Naturally, it was something not so fully religious as well. I mean, it was naturally a matter of political allegiance that was. It went in parallel with a control of society, especially at this point where it was kind of increasing, but it was still a very dynamic world where also objectively Christian persecutions were not extremely frequent, nor extremely bloody, and also they were carried out in different measures, also in different provinces of the empire. I mean, during certain imperial persecutions, actually only certain provinces were hit, others didn't care. So these were dynamics were related really to local problems, local dynamics that even were not so absolute in terms of religion as we can imagine. Not saying that of course the persecutions of the Christians weren't bloody at one point, but also they were kind of episodic. If you look at the whole history of the early Christianity. So the main problem now is that monasticism was presenting these forms of extreme consequences of Christianity. I mean, the idea that society was to be basically ignored as a whole, in part, or at least that much that was needed for showing society itself that essentially it was wrong. Because also the monastic experience sometimes started from this idea that basically living into society was into a society at least that was not regulated by certain rules, by certain discipline, could not basically save the people who were living within it. And naturally you have to think also the Christian message is it's very difficult to interpret sometimes. Especially if you look at medieval times and then naturally what the tradition has become in Christian societies and so on, there is a kind of especially in the West, a kind of a positive, but let's say everywhere actually, a kind of a positive, constructive message. I mean, there is a very strong allegiance between Christianity and society. This is typical. Ever since the public authorities Christianized the Christian society was extremely supportive of them, even justifying the same power that is present in certain passage of the scriptures, for which especially this is a Jewish tradition and also the Christianity implemented, in the sense that if in a less compromising way, but this is where it gets complex. I mean, the idea that you don't have to create too many problems to the place where you go. I mean, this was typical of the Jews that already at the time were kind of widespread, even before the diaspora around the empire, and there were small communities that lived within greater communities with a different religion. So for them it was kind of obvious not to bother the local authorities, because they had all the interests, of course, to remain there, not to be bothered. So they even were even by obviously remaining faithful to their own religion, they wouldn't create excessive trouble. And this was partly accepted by Christianity, but Christianity inherently in its message was quite difficult to interpret. In fact, the idea of giving to Caesar what is Caesar and give God what is of God is a concept that is very double, because in the actual in the original text it's really about not giving, splitting what you owe to God and what you owe to Caesar, but it's really giving back what belongs to Caesar and give to God what is to God. And this is very important, because it was basically refusing what the secular world was trying to impose on Christianity. I mean, the idea was you have to completely abandon it. That's really the Christian message. You have to give it back, because it doesn't belong to you. You have nothing to do with that. It goes its own way. If there are people who obey Caesar, who live in his empire and so on, just stay with them. But this is not Christianity. Christianity, all you have to think is about God, in a kind of a very totalizing way. And this is also what the problem that was posed, because instinctively, naturally, when Christianity was formed, there were certain compromises that had to exist. Christianity, in this sense, risked to be wiped out and persecuted even more intensely than it was, because objectively the Christian message was a very radical one at the beginning, and we have very early evidence of this. I mean, that there were problems being caused. This was told by the Roman perspective within the Jewish community, because at the beginning, Christianity, just it is objectively just a Judaic sect, and this was creating problems within the same Jewish communities at the point. So unrest, and the Romans were troubled by that. The Romans were extremely pragmatic. They cared only about social order. So if something messy was happening, they wanted to know who was making that mess and cutting it out, and not essentially producing it anymore. And this that Christianity brought to such clashes, to such debates, to such also violent confrontations that were disturbing the Roman authorities. So that also was a reason why the Christianity was seen also as kind of something subversive. Naturally, things were changing eventually when it was becoming something much more widespread, and in this sense, at the same time, much less radical. Because radical ideas, it's how we humans work. There is always this fringe of extremistic people, but the rest of the society cannot work like that. I mean, we instinctively settle down with certain compromises. Having an extremistic fringe is kind of normal. Also, if you take the average of the population, there is always the crazy, socially incompatible person who wants to make the revolution, to make a mess, and the rest of society is simply saying, what the hell are you talking about? So even with the spread of Christianity, it was something like that. Also, originally, Christianity didn't have this kind of violent nature. There were, if anything, the problems were characterized mostly by the reactions sometimes of Jewish communities, and there were also violent fringes within the same Christianity. I think in Rome, for instance, it's widely known that Peter wanted to kill Paul at that point, because they were belonged to very different positions and views. Peter belonged to the more Jewish-minded. It was St. Paul that objectively created Christianity as we know it, not even Christ. And the Romans had given him an escort, a guard, because they knew that in Rome they wanted the other Jews, the other Christians wanted to wipe them out. So this is actual history. Also, how often you hear this being told is rare, but these are pretty unknown facts. It's not that it takes very much. We know a very few about these things, and these are literally the only. If you don't know these things, it means you had never even got interested in them, because that's all we can read, we can know. But the monastic experience in its extremes was characterizing itself in the very origins, especially in Egypt, as kind of an antisocial or better experience, an experience that basically was put into discussion society as it was being conceived. And this is something that genetically monasticism always maintained, either way or in another, and it contained in itself, in fact, the kind of ambiguous nature of Christianism, that however is not ambiguous in a accidental way, or in a this just because there is one, because Christianity is based on this ambiguity. I mean, it's based on the idea that the individual has a responsibility that has to answer to by him or herself. I mean, there is no a full guide. There is a model, there is a Christian one, but what really counts is the internal struggle, is how much you're willing to suffer, essentially, to arrive to imitate Christ. So in Christianity, there is always this kind of tension that is kind of violent. Christ said, I'm here to bring this war, to separate father from son. the Christian message is polemical, is conflictual in its nature, and it is because it's not aimed at simply, reassuring. It's aimed at taking a stand, or saying, we all know what good and evil kind of are, if we think about it, and all it takes is to have the guts to make the right choice. And how this was interpreted naturally could vary wildly. So it's as if also within the same church there were two different currents that corresponded to this more administrative and secular church that lived within the cities, that were spreading into the very core of the world at the time, and another one that was progressively marginalized and deemed by Christianity as a form of extremism that went kind of its own way. And this was the division actually fueled monasticism in its especially in its cenobitic form, that is, its communitary form. Eventually, because this wasn't a matter just of being a hermit anymore. Usually also the founders of monasticism had been originally hermits, so they had kind of lived in an individual experience, but eventually they were joined by others. So this posed the problems that always remain in monasticism, how to organize the community and how to live into this utopia, if you want, and also coping with very material problems. So the first great model in monasticism is definitely the one of Saint Pachomius, who lived between 292 and 346. He operated in the desert of the Thebais in High Egypt, this together with a community of disciples that he organized with this common life through a rule that established essentially the forms of behavior, not just from a spiritual point of view, but also from a material and practical point of view. This was always kind of the dual problem that in fact the same monasticism had to find, because as long as this became a community, it was different from the individual hermetic experience that could live on the top of a column and not minding about the rest of the world. But this is the point. Every time you put some people together, you have to come to certain compromises to make them living together functionally. So there is a sort of an inherent failure that is also evident in human nature. I mean, that was recognized by Christianity. I mean, original sin is not there for a reason. Naturally, imagine that there were so many other beliefs mixed into this. I mean, and especially early Christianity had not settled the problem of Gnosticism, had not settled the problem of what is the relation between the spirit and flesh. That was a problem. It was also a matter of, the cause of many doctrinal disputes at one point, because also the most extremistic hermetic experiences were kind of underlining exactly that not only you had to abandon the world as a socially organized group, an organized society, but also to detach yourself also from your bodily experience, to live a purely spiritual life, and this struggle obviously was impossible, because the extreme was death. Naturally, if you brutalize, if you humiliate your flesh, at the point you're gonna die. And there were so many episodes also in early Christianity, also of people who were tormented so much by these spiritual problems that kind of killed themselves. They starved themselves to death through fasting and so on. And we don't have to see this as extreme. Naturally, these episodes were mediated by aristocracy, by hagiography. Sorry, because I was thinking this was happening also in the Roman aristocracy. It was there are many hagiographical texts that discuss how they were the sons of were daughters of extremely wealthy and powerful, and at that point still pagan aristocratic families, senatorial families sometimes, that died, that starved to death because of this continuous also sense of remorse, of regret, of belonging to this extremely. And there have always been these kind of individuals in society. If you think about it, people were born in for every kind of ideology, were born in extremely wealthy families, and instead of being, enjoying it, kind of trying to growing responsible, also thankful for that, they kind of feel remorse for it when there is so much suffering, there is so much poverty, and they kind of radically change their lifestyle. They go helping the poor, but also they sometimes they get overwhelmed by this existential anxiety, and they also maybe commit suicide. They're not happy by standard. So many pathologies that exist from this point of view. So even at the time, this happened in Christianity in its in this spread also towards the rest of this world. But what I was trying to say is that the individual extreme could not be achieved by a society, even if you assume that this society was small and committed, like the one of a monastery, especially at this very beginning, where society was still kind of functional and was not, it was not like in early medieval times where objectively now monasticism was useful also for other reasons, as we'll see later. The problem was that you couldn't live like that. You couldn't live by essentially destroying your human nature just for reaching contemplate. There were so many ascetic practices, but the monastic experience at that point was also developing towards this more, if you want, positive direction of trying to build something together as a group. It's also very engaging for most people, I guess. The idea of contributing to common experience and sharing common lifestyles, common belief, and so on. And these communities were very free also at the beginning. They weren't really probably so... monasticism, especially in the rules, has been kind of very harsh. And we know that it belonged to a very poor a materially poor world. But at the same time, it was extremely... also extremely spontaneous by a certain degree. Also, the written side of the rule, etc. At this point, it was much more of like an exemplary educational mean. That it wasn't really the idea of a the rules were written down for the sake of practice, but the rule was also in here as sort of an approximation of what objectively only the individual could find out, spiritually speaking, what had to be done and what had not to be done. So even the same rules, monastic rules, were substantially a something very pragmatical, something very contingent. And naturally the problem was eventually also kind of sticking to the rule in a way, saying, but has this rule to be changed? Because naturally also the founders of these monasteries became saints. They were taken as authorities. So also with the increasing dogmatism of the church, it was a sort of the idea that it was a hierarchy that had to be respected, that these authorities had been so important you had to literally stick to what they said, but not realizing that these norms, this discipline had been created with a very, very spontaneously sometimes. And naturally these figures over centuries had been kind of mythicized, and I don't know how to say that, but same, the idealized in some ways. So this is another problem of the early monasticism, but it otherwise started very, very simply, and it started also in ways that contemplated since the very beginning actually a contact with the world. That was not at all forbidden practically, and also that looked at the also pagan knowledge in many ways. I mean, the very first monastic libraries existed at this point. Also in the Thebais, we have, I think, archaeological evidence of this, or some kind of evidence of other sorts of the existence together of these small Bibles that were there. You have to forget an extremely poor world. So the library of the monastery at this point was like a closet, literally. But there have always been, as early as we know, together with the Bible, pagan texts. Always. Because at that point, classical culture, classical legacy was, was inescapable. That was the greatest accomplishment that that the world had produced at that point, culturally speaking, and these Christians read those books. They were never in denial of that civilization, that reality. And in my opinion, this is a very civilized thing. I mean, it's a very positive process, and it's at the base, objectively, of what eventually also Christian civilization was about. I mean, this compromise that existed was seen as good, as a viable choice, as a rightful choice to say, okay, let's not cut the bridges with the past. Let's understand also what others wrote. Naturally, this happened in also what the pagans wrote, naturally. And I discussed these things on Schwerpunkt extensively. If you look at medieval Christianity playlist, it's actually full of such let's say considerations on how there was a classical legacy in the Christian culture since the very beginning, and it couldn't be otherwise, obviously. And if you wait a second, I made these videos are called I'm telling you immediately now. So this is one, Christian and classical culture in late antiquity, which I deal with the problem. The Christianization of the Roman Empire is also dealing with that. The integration of Christianity into the Roman Empire. I actually made several videos about this topic. Yeah, and there will be other things, but I think that these are fun because they discuss that they're mostly about late antiquity. And that was the key moment, especially from the 4th century, when the Christians now were basically fully accepted. They could make also a career into the state and so on, because their religion past was legitimized. They started also getting educated, and they would get educated not just on the Christian texts, not on the scriptures, but also on the classical knowledge. Also because the Christians had to respond to the pagan criticism, so they basically started using their same pagan rhetorical, dialectical means that could ensure. And this was still a world that was very much concentrated also on a public speaking, the public life, as long as especially the late antique culture survived, also infrastructurally speaking, in terms of the cities, of the libraries and so on. It was a world where people spoke in the streets, in the squares, in the forum, and they debated such things. So it had been, think about the Areopagus, where St. Paul discussed, in Athens. So that's kind of, that was it. It was also a way to reach to the masses. So you understand that this, also the monasticism couldn't be fully cut off by such events. by such dynamism that existed out there. And it was pretty normal also to have a kind of temporary monastic experience. I mean, monasticism at this point was not categorized like something for life. You could participate to these communities, to go there, but also to come back to the world, and it was fine. They were quite open, quite flexible in this sense. Another very important monastic center was the one founded by Saint Basil the Great, who lived between 330 roughly and 370 in Cappadocia, at the center of the Anatolic Peninsula. So also in here, regions that were kind of more isolated. You know, the hinterland of Anatolia is not a very... there are many kind of wild areas, as we have seen before. The Thebais in Egypt is kind of a desertic area. So places were chosen here to be kind of isolated from the rest of it. In the case of Anatolia, it was mostly a civilization there. It's developed especially in the coastal centers, and the most also vivacious cities at the time were along this kind of Levantine coast, from Anatolia and also Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, and so on. So sometimes and this was typical of the Mediterranean civilization. It was mostly a coastal civilization. The major centers had developed along the coasts. So these were, and it could go relatively few kilometers into the hinterland and to see basically very desolated scenario. I mean, at this time, sure, the ancient world was still functioning, but as I often say, you don't have to think the ancient world to be, I don't know, the golden age. It was still an extremely poor world by so many standards, so it's that's not, I guess, a surprise. So it was full of these wild environments where these people could form a community. Saint Basil would be extremely important, would be the base actually for Eastern monasticism, Eastern Christian monasticism, whereas in West there were other models, as we'll see now. So, and this is exactly the point, talking about the West. The West had, now it would be too complicated to explain, generally speaking, why the West had these characteristics that in the ancient world it was also very much influential for the medieval times. Had always, compared to the East, a kind of more practical, pragmatic character. And this was the side that was more accepted of the Cenobitic experience in the West, with way more favor than mystical tension aimed at Hermetism instead had. So Western society, especially after the fall of the Western Empire and with the barbarian invasions and the constant track of war, and now crippled by economical crisis and so on, had a very different development than the West. In part, it was already very different, but this transformation was much more evident in the transition between late antiquity and the early medieval times was much more felt, if you want, into the West. I made a video also in here that deals exactly with this, that is called Transformation of the West between the 3rd and the 6th century. So if you're interested, I explain also partly this aspect of monasticism. If at a certain point it can serve as a general background. So, what we're talking about, the cities were declining, they were not safe anymore, because also the wars usually targeted the cities for loot and so on. and it the even in the countryside it was usually safer. However, it was a great crisis, and communities tended to live always more kind of in kind of encastled and sheltered into these ville. So these essentially fortresses slash farms, practically. So the West lived more deeply, probably, in this need of a reorganization, not only of existence, but also of production, of goods, of resources, and this was definitely a very felt transformation. If you read the sources from these times, I mean, usually in the West now, the majority of sources were from people who were kind of better educated, were kind of the top of society, could see it even in more kind of even in historical perspective a bit. Maybe the rest of the population wasn't really aware of the general transformation. I mean, they also, people at this time had a much smaller historical, I mean, time. I mean, the memory of the past was came from very few years before. It didn't go past the living generations. There wasn't much of a interest for the past among the average people. That also the city inhabitants didn't remember probably moments like the 5th century. I don't know, Cicero, or I don't know what this past of this classical past was anymore. So there is a kind of a dramatic tone given us also by the sources that definitely reflects the perspective of the elites that we're seeing, especially their control in society kind of collapsing in certain ways. So that was more dramatic for them. But for the majority of the population, perhaps it was kind of less. The whole situation was less dramatic, or at least it was surely dramatic for them, but it wasn't so different from what it had always they had always been kind of used to. But there was a great kind of need to reorganize society from different bases, and there is this sense of existential trouble in this idea of a world that is collapsing and you don't know what to do about it. So many people would choose the monastic way, the monastic option. It was objectively not very different from much of what daily life had become, and was sometimes a better way to kind of survive also than other experiences. And this is where Benedictine monasticism actually came into play, because that kind of gave an answer to those questions. It, the Benedictine Rule has been written. Today we even question the existence of Saint Benedict as a historical figure, because objectively there is no evidence of it. This was probably a rule that was created by. There was definitely an author that, in this sense, we can't call it Saint Benedict, but it first of all, it takes so much from other experiences. It was written over time. It was not necessarily how eventually the story of Saint Benedict and it has been, but nevertheless, it's a rule that comes exactly from that world. From 6th century central Italy, that was at that point like it's as if a nuclear bomb had fallen on the peninsula with the Gothic War, and it shows us also. It's a very, aside from the religious and monastic content that is very interesting, but it also shows us indirectly the picture of a world like the one it was at the point, marked by extreme poverty, especially in the countryside, and this place where there was no nothing to eat. I mean, much of the early medieval Christian monastic geography is all concentrated on this. I mean, the idea that the monastery is blessed by God because it's also located into a place that miraculously produces food. I mean, this world was made up of very poor materials, very poor tools that anyway can be extremely precious. Also for the surrounding peasant communities to survive, to plough the land, to find resources and so on. So a world that was now settling definitely on a very different base and very different structure than it had been before, with a world like the Roman one that had been so active from especially an economical point of view. So, I mean, so international in traffics, and that basically could also afford to, I don't know, buy food from foreign lands and to satisfy to feed the mob and so on. Now everybody was on their own. Obviously, it's not even so dramatic as it sounds, because naturally I've tried to explain also in Schwerpunkt how early medieval times weren't so disastrous as we imagined them. Life continued for most of the people in a kind of a normal way from their perspective, even if naturally it's very different from our own today, and we would find it pretty harsh, pretty miserable, but that was reality, and we don't have to be influenced by the embellishments of that ancient world made of itself, and really look at how life had always been, especially in the countryside, in the latifundia, in all these centers that were all but, so beautiful places to live compared to the city, and actually the elites that live in there, because also living into a Roman city, don't think it's so nice. It's depicted that, how you spent all the day just, I don't know, going to the circus or taking a bath in the thermates, and no, it wasn't like that. Roman cities were terrible places to live in, objectively, for the poor people. And they were not hygienic at all, as on the contrary it's said, the aqueducts and all this stuff were created exactly because the places weren't, so there was this evident need to require it. There was a much higher demographic concentration in other times in history in this century, so all problems that shouldn't let us indulge to obviously conceive this progressivistic idea of the world. Naturally, it was a functional world. It wasn't also in there, not a nightmare, but it was still, it would surprise us also for the kind of the overall misery that it still existed also in the at the peak of greatness, let's say, of development of the ancient world. There is also another thing to consider, that is that how monasticism spread into other countries that at that point were not Christian, because the Christian church now had began to acquire to the new faith also peoples that up to that point had lived at the periphery of the empire or even beyond the limes. So Christianism at this point didn't really it wasn't really just a Mediterranean phenomenon like it had been at the beginning. We were expanding in Central Europe, and the only kind of continuity in this sense was partly the Roman direction of the story. I mean, Rome now as a political center in terms of an imperial center was kind of declining. Rome remained one of the biggest, actually the largest city in the West, and the one of the most important centers of the time. But there was this translation from this shifting of power naturally towards the east, but Rome kept being through the papacy, the center of this new Christianity. that was taking kind of more of a Western direction. Naturally, at this time, the idea of Rome as an important center, as we will see now, was growing, but at the same time, it was still very different from how we imagine it. Also, Rome in herself now was pretty much tied to the east, much more than it was to the west. This was typical of many, especially Italian cities that were, especially the coastal ones, were kind of always interconnected with Eastern Christianity, and in fact, there were very consistent Greek communities that also had this kind of more Eastern influence, also Near Eastern monastic experiences more closely at range. But Rome was also expanding now towards continental and northern Europe even. So these worlds that were had been so relatively superficially Romanized in history. I mean, relatively, because it depends. Because Gaul, for instance, being a Central Western European land, it was intensely Romanized, but also in there the differences between the north and the south were very meaningful. But think about Britain, or think now about parts of Germany that were knowing Christianity just at this point. So Papal Rome managed to shift pretty much its it basically managed to create kind of its own autonomy into the direction of the spread of Christianity, the direction of evangelization, and so on. But there is also an outer world of Christianity at this point that is very much forgotten, because many Christian churches at this point had been founded in Persia, in India, in Ethiopia, in Central Asia, also at the borders of China, and also in Europe. This far northwest of Ireland, for instance, is very important, with St. Patrick, we believe, roughly between 390 460 AD. So exactly into these moments were it's usual to say AD, sorry, this one. But also in these moments that you would expect, everything was kind of collapsing. And this is why monasticism was so important, because monasticism was spreading, said, exactly at this point. Exactly at the moment of greater trouble, of greater instability. And this shows how this experience was kind of attractive, kind of convenient, kind of fitting and suitable for many people who were living into these areas. And especially in the Irish tradition, this is very important, because the Irish monasticism definitely recollected certain ancient Celto-Iberian pagan traditions that were at this point, however, basically syncretized together with other strong, equally strong and widespread monastical institutions. So also, if you look at continental Europe, especially the arrival of this kind of barbarians, how you want to call them, into the territories of the western half of the Roman Empire, and the affirmation of Christianism spreading within it, were two phenomena that are to be understood together, because they were essentially linked one to the other, and they were complementary in many ways, and they allowed in the following centuries the birth of a new synthesis that went that was characterized, that had certain unique features you don't find in the East, not even in Eastern Christianity, and that was at the base of say the most iconic monasticism we know in the West and all of its characteristics. So also today we didn't even discuss much about I thought I would have time to discuss also about Saint Benedict and so on, but this is not really the point. The point I wanted to make is this kind of thought-provoking idea that monasticism is born out of, especially in the West, as a form of compromise, of positive compromise between the various instances of society and the affirmation of a new course. That naturally it's difficult to individuate, to kind of to objectify as such, and to define precisely, but that definitely true monasticism is observable in itself. So this idea of escaping from the world because the world is not a satisfactory experience anymore, or to want to see it in a more probably more realistic way, an experience that has to be complementary to this situation. It was typical at this time in Western Christianity that especially that you basically would join the community, the monastic communities for a certain time, then come back to be something else, like a bishop even in a city. This was typical, for instance, of southern Gallic monasticism, especially the experience of the Lorraine Islands, that at this point were the most important cultural center of the monastic West, where it was normal for the sons of the senatorial/ecclesiastical elites to be sent to practice, to have this experience of retirement on the Lorraine Island. I love the Lorraine because I went there so many times in vacations. It's just in front of Antibes, where Napoleon landed when he escaped from Elba. They're beautiful places, and I went there, and it's and when they were done, essentially they would come back into Provence and start living into these cities that that in the Rhone basin that were still very widespread in southern Gaul. Late antique culture didn't die out by some traumatic experience like it happened in Italy, for instance. It kind of and also compared to the north of France, that was much more Germanized and kind of also less developed. Those were centers that were developing, in fact, were kind of the peak of also ecclesiastical organization into the cities, into the dioceses, and that were now experimenting that particular lifestyle. And this is obviously also looking at monasticism and all the ways it developed at this point in the various regions of Europe. It really makes you understand a lot about what the local society also was about. There were many different environments at this point, very different political and social situations, and also the point of understanding the arrival of the barbarians, the creation of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms is very important, because these communities also were to grow kind of intertwined with these political events. Think about Saint Columba. From the north, would basically re-evangelize the continent through the relation with the Franks, with the Longobards, with these continental kings that allowed the spread of its monasticism and so on. This is something that happened also later, also in Carolingian times. So experiences, lifestyles, and ideas that were now kind of trying to solve a great problem, this reorganization of the Latin Germanic West, that was very slowly kind of trying to recover from this moment of major, shrinking of of uh, I would say of civilization, in the sense that obviously it was a great contraction, also dynamically, economically, and so on. And that Christianity, in this sense, was providing an answer for, but monasticism was providing, especially also the aside, at least, of the practical nature of it. Monasteries were becoming centers of communities that worked, that preserved the ancient knowledge, that were kind of reorganizing the territory, that were very, very actually tied now to the local peasantry. It was getting progressively evangelized and was living and working together with the monks. And this pragmatic character actually exists also in the in the secular organization of the clergy, because also bishops at this time were actually doing a very good job in terms of maintaining, preserving society. They had remained, after all, in control of society after the Roman Empire had vanished, and now the Germanic elites were necessarily requiring them to cooperate and in fact they would often these ecclesiastical and Germanic elites would intermarry pretty often, giving birth also here to the Carolingians, for instance. The Carolingian dynasty, for instance, descends essentially from these unions. But that's just one of the examples. Okay, so this is more. I would stop here. I know I didn't probably discuss the creation of monasticism in itself. So also in the description I will modify actually the intro. But the important thing here is to remember the non-linear path that certain phenomena take, and especially why, because sometimes we need to feel that certain phenomena impose themselves. Even many people read the spread of Christianity as a sort of imposition. A phenomenon like that cannot spread if there is no structural reason, and if there is not a sort of demand by the same society. These were not times in which even the authorities could do much about the spread of certain ideas. The Christianity in the Roman Empire is the perfect proof of this. The Christians originated like a sect that was immediately kind of persecuted. Nevertheless, it arrived so easily, relatively easily, or at least very spontaneously. This is probably the best adverb to become religion of state. And this was a less dramatic process than what is often described. Of course, there was a lot of violence, a lot of figured the mobs, city mobs, that really fought a lot about it over these things, but it wasn't really about religion itself. It was religion as an excuse, essentially, to seize power as a certain faction, and things would continue like that. In fact, especially in the major metropolitic centers. The greatest problem in this world at the end of late antiquity were with centers like Alexandria, like Jerusalem, like Antioch and Constantinople, that were at that point not fighting over doctrinal issues for the sake of itself, but just for concealing behind it very important political dynamics, chiefly the fact that those eastern cities wanted to be independent from Constantinople. The same happened a little bit with Rome, but Rome and Constantinople were a bit more actually supportive, let's say sympathetic toward each other. Obviously they didn't like each other at all. Also because Constantinople had this kind of inferiority complex in not having been one of the historical seats of the martyrs, and then the idea that having become now the center of the empire was something that had to be nobilitated in some fashion, but Rome was actually very orthodox at this point, and on the contrary, when Constantinople started practically trying to appease a little bit the eastern metropolitic seats because of these doctrinal issues and because they didn't want to lose the eastern provinces, Rome was adverse to Constantinople because objectively it was right. It was saying, what are you doing? Are you enforcing, or you're becoming heterodox, saying weird stuff, borderline with heresy, for what, essentially? And so the Church of Rome at this point was very very clever in so many aspects. But naturally we will have to discuss them, and it's not today's topic, but just for saying that also there are certain major directions you can't see in this phenomenon that naturally could have taken completely other paths. Sometimes they were related to the greatest popes. So think about Leo the Great or Gregory the Great, or who really changed the course of history, and kind of understanding, because I believe this is the great understanding what these bigger waves, towards which directions such bigger waves are going. And this is very important in history. It happens many times. The Church of Rome played very cleverly its cards at this point, and it was able essentially to create, in fact, especially through the monastic experience, a net that managed to tie herself to the spread of Christianity into the rest of other Facebook message, into the rest of Europe. And this is probably the great story we'll have to see on Schwerpunkt of how also Western Christianity began to develop, even in part accidentally, something on its own. And that has to take into consideration, naturally, not just the papal direction, but also the different cultural premises that were at the base of the West. Also, Irish monasticism was something that really changed a lot into European history, and especially in the conversion of these Central European populations and their. But this is whatever. This is not really the topic for now. I stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.